Unit 2, Lesson 7, The Spanish-American War.
Unit 2, Lesson 7, Vocabulary. The causes and effects of the Spanish-American War. The causes were Cuban rebels against Spanish, winning U.S. sympathy. The yellow press inflames the opinions against Spain, and the USS Maine explodes. The Spanish-American War, when Commodore Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet near the Philippines. Filipino nationalists defeat the Spanish army on the islands. United States Army wins in Cuba in 1898. And the United States began its occupation of Puerto Rico. The effects of the Spanish-American War were that the United States acquired the Philippines. Spain gave up control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. A debate occurs nationally about imperialism, and the U.S. empire greatly expands, leading the period of American imperialism. In 1868, Cuba, one of the few remaining Spanish colonies in Latin America, rebelled. After 10 years, the revolution collapsed. In 1878, rebel leaders led by José Martí fled to the United States and began to gather American support. War loomed between Spain and Cuba. Cubans had been under Spanish rule since the landing of Columbus in 1492. But the people of Cuba wanted their independence, and in 1868 they staged a revolt that was put down 10 years later. In 1895, a new revolt broke out, but Spain was even more furious this time, thinking that it's time to punish these rebels so they don't try a revolution again. Spain's response to this latest revolution was a policy of reconcentration, the forced movement of large numbers of people into detention camps for military or political reasons. After about 200,000 Cubans died in these camps, Cuban exile José Martí appealed to the United States Congress and the citizens for help. In order to suppress the rebellion, the Spanish instituted a policy of Reconstruction. Reconstruction where the Spanish forced Cuban rebels into detention camps and fortified towns. The prisoners starved to death, and many died due to the spread of disease. These reconcentration camps in Cuba had horrifying conditions, where hunger, starvation, and diseases led to the death of tens of thousands of Cubans, up to one-fourth of the island's population. As the death count grew, Cuba's economy fell apart, and its countryside was completely destroyed. March 17, 1898, Vermont Senator Redfield Proctor delivered one of the most significant speeches of the Spanish-American War era. After an observation visit to Cuba, Senator Proctor returned to the United States and told Congress about Cuba's bleak situation. I quote, "I went to Cuba with a strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn. I could not believe that out of a population of 1,600,000, 200,000 had died within these Spanish forts. My inquiries were entirely outside of sensational sources. What I saw I cannot tell so that others can see it. It must be seen with one's own eyes to be realized. To me the strongest appeal is not the barbarity practiced by Weyler, nor the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire native population of Cuba, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment of which I ever had knowledge." Senator Proctor's words, unlike those of the sensationalist press, were taken seriously by congressional Republicans and the U.S. business community. Proctor, a former Civil War colonel, Vermont governor, and businessman, was highly respected and trusted by U.S. conservatives. When Senator Proctor spoke, the pro-war feeling among the U.S. business community grew, and the United States moved even closer to war. Senator Proctor in regard to the children of Cuba, as shown on the screen, end quote. Little children are still walking about with arms and chest terribly emaciated, eyes swollen, and abdomen bloated to 3 times the natural size. Many Americans were sympathetic toward the Cuban cause. The cause drew a parallel to America's struggle for freedom against the British. They were geographically close, and the yellow journalism in the media dramatized the events. Others who had money invested in Cuba wanted the United States to intervene to protect their interests and investments. American investors were tied to sugar and rice plantations, railroads, and iron mines. And so the power of the newspaper was at play. Despite all the negative news coming from Cuba, neither President Cleveland nor President McKinley would intervene. Newspaper publishers William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer tried to provoke American citizens to call for war. William Randolph Hearst was quoted as saying, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." And that headlines sell newspapers and sold newspapers equal revenue. Through yellow journalism, they ran headlines and stories that played up to the horror of Cuba. Finally, when fighting broke out in Havana, Cuba's capital city, President McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to protect American lives and property. As we've talked about before, yellow journalism is reporting the news in a sensational way that often bends the truth to sell more papers and shape public opinion. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank, taking down the lives of 260 men. Americans blamed Spain, and "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry for revenge. The big question in the news was who sank the Maine? The US pointed the finger at Spain, and Spain pointed the finger back at the United States. Who would you believe, the Spanish government or your American newspapers, who published images like this on the bottom right-hand corner? A look at Pulitzer's New York Journal. Who do you think the journal is placing the blame on for destruction of the USS Maine? And so the United States goes to war. Although President McKinley wanted to make peace with Spain, he finally gave in and asked Congress to declare war on April 11, 1898. Surprisingly, the first battle was not fought in Cuba, but in the Philippines, half a world away. And the Spanish-American War was now being fought on 2 fronts. In Cuba, 90 miles away off the coast of Florida, and in the Philippines, closer to Asia and China. And you can see on the map here with the United States represented in the center of the map in green, Spain represented near the right of the map in red in the Spanish Empire, and how the war, the Spanish-American War of 1898, was fought on 2 fronts, in Cuba, just south of Florida, and in the Philippines, on the other side of the world. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt believed the war would expand, so he telegraphed Commodore George Dewey to move American ships to the Philippines. Dewey then received help from a Philippine rebel leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was already fighting to rid his land of Spanish rule. Americans soon took control of the Philippine Islands. In the Philippines, the United States attacked Spain. The Americans had the advantage of better ships and better technology, and the United States won decisively with not one casualty versus 400 Spanish deaths. Commodore George Dewey planned the attack at the capital city of Manila, again partnered with Emilio Aguinaldo, the rebel Filipino leader, Spain surrendered shortly after the attack in 1898. Headlines around the world chronicled the American victory in the Pacific. Paintings were commissioned to celebrate America's victory in the Pacific. When the war shifted to Cuba, the main fighting took place near the city of Santiago and at sea. Theodore Roosevelt, who had given up his Navy post, led the Rough Riders unit in a successful charge up San Juan Hill, which became a highlight of the war and a turning point for American victory. The United States Navy then destroyed the Spanish fleet trapped in Santiago Harbor. Within 2 weeks, the Spanish surrendered Cuba. The United States then focused their attention on Puerto Rico, where U.S. forces invaded Spanish-controlled Puerto Rico and quickly brought it under U.S. command. The post-war relations between the U.S. and Cuba were not good after the U.S. forced Cuba to adopt rules that favored the interests of the United States, especially the United States business interests, with the Platt Amendment. This specifically set up rules to protect the United States business interests in Cuba, especially agriculturally, where many crops were grown in Cuba that were important for American businessmen. Cubans did not appreciate this treatment, obviously, and would soon find themselves at odds with the American political establishment and American business culture. Look back on the timeline of the Spanish-American War through the important dates. The U.S. declared war on April 25, 1898, proceeded to steer its way towards victory with the Battle of Manila Bay in May 1st, captured Guam June 21st. U.S. troops officially landed in Cuba on June 22nd. The Rough Riders and Theodore Roosevelt led the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1st, captured the city of Santiago on July 17th, invaded Puerto Rico on July 25th, captured Manila Bay and the Spanish surrender on August 13th. And then the Paris Peace Treaty was signed December 10th, 1898, where Spain relinquished control in the area.